My father stood at the head of his own dining table on November 23rd, pointed at the door, and told our housekeeper to have my bags packed within the hour. I was 27, 5 months pregnant, and had just refused for the third time that evening to tell him the name of my baby's father. "Throw her out," he said. Not to me, but to the room, as though I'd already stopped being someone he addressed directly. 6 weeks later, a manila envelope arrived at my aunt's apartment containing a DNA report that would prove neither of us understood what we were actually fighting about. I'm Claire Ashford, an architect 27 years old, living in a converted loft I'd purchased 3 years earlier with savings from a firm where I'd made partner track associate faster than anyone in the office's 12-year history. I'd never once, before that Thanksgiving, given my father a real reason to doubt my judgment. That was precisely why his reaction hollowed me out the way it did. It wasn't protective. It was something closer to punishment. My father, Walter Ashford, 61, built a private cardiology practice into a $40 million regional medical group over 30 years. A career built on precision, discipline, and an almost pathological need for appearances to match reality exactly. He'd raised me alone from the time I was 8, after my mother Eleanor died from complications of a pulmonary embolism during what should have been a routine outpatient procedure, a loss he never discussed with me in any detail beyond the clinical facts. I hadn't withheld my baby's father's name out of shame. Marcus Delgado, 29, was a structural engineer I'd been with for 14 months, currently completing a 6-month infrastructure contract in Southeast Asia with limited communication access, a circumstance I hadn't yet found the right moment to explain fully. My father assumed the silence meant something worse, an affair, a stranger, a decision he could neither approve of nor control. And control, I'd learn later, mattered to him more than I'd ever fully understood. I stayed with my Aunt Diane, my mother's younger sister, in her 2-bedroom apartment for 6 weeks, working remotely, attending prenatal appointments alone, and speaking to my father exactly 0 times. Diane, watching me some nights sitting silently on her fire escape, finally said the thing I hadn't let myself consider. "You know this isn't really about Marcus. Your father's been performing certainty about this family for 30 years. You just handed him something he couldn't perform his way through." At 26 weeks, a routine anatomy scan flagged a soft marker associated with a recessive genetic condition requiring both biological parents' genetic histories for accurate risk assessment. A standard protocol my obstetrician, Dr. Anita Reyes, explained calmly but firmly needed resolution before delivery planning could proceed safely. With Marcus still overseas and difficult to reach quickly, Dr. Reyes recommended pulling available paternal line genetic history from any accessible family member. That meant, uncomfortably, reopening contact with my father. I called him on a Tuesday afternoon, keeping the conversation clinical, explaining only that the hospital needed family genetic history. Not that I needed him personally. His voice, when he finally answered, carried something I hadn't heard directed at me before. Not anger, but a kind of held breath caution, as though he'd been waiting 6 weeks for a call he didn't know how to ask for himself. Walter agreed to submit a cheek swab through the hospital's genetics department, framed purely as a medical formality. What none of us anticipated was that the lab's comprehensive parentage and carrier panel, standard for cases involving limited paternal access, cross-referenced existing familial markers, including unrequested but automatically flagged, a paternity confirmation between Walter and me, run as a routine quality control check the lab performs on all family-linked genetic submissions. The report arrived at Diane's apartment on a Thursday, addressed to me, containing 2 sections. One addressing the baby's carrier risk, entirely unremarkable and low risk, and a second section neither Dr. Reyes' office nor I had specifically requested. A parentage exclusion between Walter Ashford and me, with a 99.98% certainty that Walter was not my biological father. Time seemed to stand still as I read the second section 3 times, waiting for the letters to rearrange themselves into something less impossible. Walter Ashford, the man who'd inspected my report cards, chosen my college shortlist, and just 6 weeks earlier ordered me out of his house over a question of parentage, had spent my entire life raising a daughter who biologically wasn't his. I drove to his house that same evening unannounced, envelope in hand, and found him already sitting at the kitchen table as though he'd somehow known this day was coming for longer than 6 weeks. His trembling voice, the first genuinely unguarded thing I'd heard from him in years, answered my question before I finished asking it. "I've known since you were 4 months old. Your mother told me herself." Eleanor, Walter explained, had a 7-month relationship during a period of significant strain in their marriage, roughly 2 years into their union, while Walter was completing a demanding cardiology fellowship that kept him at the hospital nearly 90 hours a week. She'd ended the relationship, become pregnant with me shortly after reconciling with Walter, and told him the truth within weeks of learning she was pregnant herself, unwilling to build a family on a lie she couldn't sustain. Walter, then 28 himself, chose to raise me as his own. Not out of denial, he insisted, but a decision he described as the only one that made sense to him. Biology told me one fact. Watching your mother hold you the night you were born told me a much bigger one. I decided the second fact mattered more. For 27 years, he never told me, and never, until that Thanksgiving, let the fact visibly shape how he treated me. Understanding his history didn't soften what he'd done 6 weeks earlier. If anything, it sharpened it. Walter had built his entire identity around choosing me despite biology, yet the moment I withheld information under circumstances far less fraught than his own marriage once was, he'd reacted with the exact rigidity he'd spent 30 years insisting he'd overcome. I told him plainly, "You know exactly what it feels like to be judged for something complicated. You did it to me anyway." Walter told me the rest reluctantly. My biological father was Thomas Reyes, a hospital pharmacist Eleanor had known for years before their brief relationship, who had relocated out of state not long after, apparently unaware Eleanor had become pregnant during their relationship rather than after it ended, a timeline detail Eleanor herself may have misjudged, given how quickly the pregnancy overlapped both relationships. Using the genetic database's opt-in relative matching feature, I located Thomas Reyes within 3 weeks, now 63, retired, living 340 miles away, and as it turned out, entirely unaware he had a biological daughter. Our first phone call lasted 90 minutes, mostly silence punctuated by careful, uncertain questions from 2 strangers who shared, we'd later confirm, an identical rare blood antigen marker that had shown up, coincidentally, on my own prenatal panel weeks earlier. Rather than compete for relevance during those 3 weeks, Walter did something I hadn't anticipated. He attended 6 sessions of family therapy alone, a decision he made without telling me until after the fact, working through what his own therapist later described, with Walter's permission to share generally, as a lifelong pattern of controlling outcomes to avoid confronting the parts of his story he never processed. I gave birth to my daughter, Eleanor Diane Ashford Delgado, on a Tuesday morning in March, named for both women who'd shaped my understanding of what family absorbs and forgives. Marcus made it home 11 days before her due date. Walter arrived at the hospital within 2 hours of my call, sitting in the waiting room the entire 11 hours of labor. The same room, Diane later told me, where he'd once waited for me 27 years earlier without knowing yet what he'd decide to do with the truth he'd just learned. 8 months later, Walter funded a $1.8 million endowment at his hospital system supporting genetic counseling access for families navigating complicated paternity or carrier screening results, specifically ensuring counseling support extended beyond the purely clinical, addressing the family and identity questions genetic testing increasingly surfaces alongside medical ones, a gap he cited from personal experience without ever mentioning specifics publicly. Walter and Thomas met exactly once, at my request, at a dinner that was stiff, brief, and ultimately unnecessary beyond the courtesy of it. Biology and relationship, we all seemed to understand by then, weren't asking to compete for the same title. Walter attends my daughter's pediatric appointments now, introduces himself without hesitation as her grandfather, and has never once, in the 2 years since, asked me to justify anything about my life before offering his support first. My father ordered me out of his house over a question of parentage he'd spent 27 years quietly deciding didn't define our relationship. The DNA test that arrived 6 weeks later didn't punish him. It forced him to remember the exact grace he'd once extended to a 4-month-old he had every legal and biological right to walk away from. The lesson isn't that the truth always humbles the people who withhold it. It's that the people who understand best what it costs to be truly chosen, rather than simply inherited, are sometimes the very people who forget to offer that same choice to someone else, until the truth insists they remember.